In 1524, less than 10 years after the start of the Protestant Reformation, war broke out in the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany. It wasn't a war between Catholics and Protestants per se. It was more of an uprising of peasants and farmers against the ruling class. One might say it was the early struggle for democracy. This was known as the German Peasants' War. While the war was condemned by Martin Luther, it was supported by more religious radicals like Thomas Müntzer and Huldrych Zwingli. We often think about the Protestant Reformation as an uprising against the Catholic Church. However, the Reformation was part of a much larger social revolution against hierarchical structures, whether they be ecclesiastical or governmental. A number of episodes ago, we talked about conciliarism. This was a belief that a council could overrule a pope. So, in a sense, democracy. We saw this particularly with the Council of Basel, which continued to meet even after the pope disbanded it. This was the tinder that was already piling up when the Protestant reformers lit their matches. The Protestant Reformation was the religious backdrop for a number of other social revolutions. From Germany to Switzerland to France to England, the 16th century saw major political and ecclesiastical upheaval. Entire cities and even countries were breaking away from the Catholic Church. This would eventually lead the Church to convene its 19th Ecumenical Council, the Council of Trent. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. If you're new to Why Catholic, welcome. Just as a brief introduction, I spent 39 years in various Protestant circles, including 11 years as a Baptist pastor. I was the co-founder of a ministry called Christianity is Jewish, and after a couple of years of study, prayer, and discernment, I came home to the Catholic Church at age 41. In this podcast, I take complex theological and historical topics related to the Catholic faith and break them down into bite-sized pieces in episodes that are about 17 minutes in length. That's a TED Talk rule. Why Catholic is 100% listener supported, and so if you've been blessed by this podcast, I'd ask that you consider becoming a patron. Your generosity goes a long way into making this podcast possible. One thing that you can do that costs absolutely nothing is to go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give this podcast a 5-star rating and even leave it a little review. Those reviews help others find this podcast as well. Thank you so much for your support. We are nearing the end of a series that has been all-consuming. I'm looking forward to getting back to a little less historically heavy topics that don't require hours and hours of research. But we have 3 councils left to discuss, and these are 3 very important ones, beginning with the Council of Trent. In the last episode, we talked about the Protestant Revolution. I mentioned that we often talk about the Protestant Reformation like a monolith, but in reality, from the very beginning, it was anything but that. The German Reformation was led by Martin Luther, but his counterpart in Zurich, named Huldrych Zwingli, had wildly different views than Luther about pretty much every theological topic. Then a little later, you had John Calvin in Geneva, who began the Calvinist movement, who was somewhere between Luther and Zwingli. Then a bit after that, King Henry VIII began the Church of England, which broke ties with the Catholic Church, and while we call it the English Reformation, it really was an entirely different category than the rest of the Protestant Reformation that was happening in Germany, Switzerland, and France. One common sentiment is that Luther won the battle, but ultimately Zwingli won the war. In other words, at the time, Luther's theology prevailed in 16th century Europe, but today, evangelicalism adheres much closer to Zwingli's radical theology than to Luther's ideas. Martin Luther's goal was really to get the church to convene an ecumenical council. We've seen this in the past with individuals stirring trouble and ultimately thinking that a council would side with them. However, the Pope was reluctant to convene a council. On one hand, the Fifth Lateran Council had concluded in 1517, just before Luther had published his 95 Thesis. And secondly, conciliarism was a popular idea, and Luther's supporters were calling for a council that would exclude the Pope. So there was really no upside for the Pope to convene a council. In the mid-1520s, Pope Clement VII considered calling a council. However, in 1527, a group of mutinous Lutheran troops who belonged to Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire went rogue and attacked papal Rome, raping, killing, burning, and stealing. St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel were used to stable horses, and ultimately this convinced Pope Clement VII to delay calling a council. Pope Paul III issued a decree for a general council to be held in Mantua, Italy, to begin on May 23, 1537. However, due to a war between France and the Holy Roman Empire, hardly anyone showed up. Even though Martin Luther had established documents explaining what Protestants would and wouldn't agree to, Ultimately, Protestants refused to attend as well. Pope Paul III then decided to move the council to Vicenza, and participation was poor there as well. This forced him to indefinitely postpone it on May the 21st, 1539. After a series of delays, the council would eventually get underway on December 13th, 1545, in Trent, also called Trento, a city in the Alps in modern-day Italy. The Council of Trent took place in 25 sessions over the course of 18 years. Historians tend to break it down into 3 segments related to the 3 popes who reigned during the time of the council. In reality, there were actually 4 popes during this period, but more on that in a minute. However, it should be noted that none of the popes actually ever attended the Council of Trent, opting instead to send papal legates. In the show notes, I've included a link to the Papal Encyclicals website, which I've done for each episode. This one has links to each session where you can read the published decrees of each of the 25 sessions. To discuss what happened at the Council of Trent, I want to highlight a number of the important sessions where significant decrees were issued. In Session 4, which took place in April of 1546, the Council reaffirmed the 73-book canon of sacred scripture. As part of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther had originally proposed his own standard of authority, which he called Christ preached. To the degree he thought a book preached Christ, that was the determining factor for if it should be included in the Bible. He originally proposed removing the 7 Deuterocanonicals from the Old Testament, as well as Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation from the New Testament. Ultimately, his version didn't exclude any New Testament books, but it did have some textual additions like the word alone added to Romans 3:28 so that it read faith alone. And in his version, the 7 Deuterocanonicals were put in an appendix called the Apocrypha, meaning hidden. Eventually, Bible publishers just began leaving those 7 books out. Remember that the 73-book canon was already reaffirmed at the Council of Florence 200 years earlier, so it was already dogmatically defined. The Council of Trent was like, okay, for the last time, the Bible includes these 73 books. Case closed. And if you want a little refresher on how the Catholic Church understands terms like doctrine and dogma and how doctrine can develop into a dogma, I recommend episode 146, the introduction to this series, as well as episode 65 entitled From Doctrine to Dogma. This 4th session from the Council of Trent also prohibited people from interpreting Scripture contrary to the Catholic Church and the Church Fathers. It furthermore restricted profane publications, whether that be a random translation of Scripture, haphazard translations, or anonymous commentaries with all sorts of wild ideas. In reading this section, you really get the sense that the printing press was a little bit like today's internet. Anyone could just about publish any sort of wild thing. Session 5 dictated the emphasis on the rigorous and faithful study and teaching of sacred scripture to the masses. Session 6, which took place in January of 1547, focused on the doctrine of justification. Martin Luther had proposed the idea of sola fide, or faith alone, that Christians are justified by faith alone. And this idea spawned a number of other Protestant doctrines, like the Calvinist idea of the perseverance of the saints, meaning one cannot lose their salvation. This session comprehensively addressed all of these topics from sola fide to predestination. And for those that claim that us Catholics believe in a works-based salvation, I just want to point you to Canon 1 of this session, which states, quote, "If any one saith that man may be justified before God by his own works, whether done through the teaching of human nature or that of the law, without the grace of God through Jesus Christ, let him be anathema," end quote. Session 7, which occurred in March of 1547, focused on sacraments. Remember that Huldrych Zwingli in particular had advocated doing away with the sacraments and taught that communion was a symbolic memorial meal. This session reaffirms the 7 sacraments and the sacramental worldview that is the bedrock of ancient Christianity. Pope Paul III died in November of 1549 and was succeeded by Pope Julius III, who resumed the council in its 10th session. The 13th session, which occurred in October 1551, focused on the Eucharist. If you recall from the last episode, Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli had 3 very different ideas of Holy Communion. Luther argued for the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Calvin believed in a type of spiritual presence, which is called consubstantiation, and Zwingli believed it was merely a symbolic meal. At this session, the Catholic Church reaffirmed its teachings on the Eucharist, enshrining them as dogma. The 14th session, which occurred in November of 1551, focused on the sacrament of penance. The 15th session granted safe passage to Protestants who wanted to travel in order to attend the council. It should be noted that Martin Luther died in 1546, just after the Council of Trent finally got underway. Pope Julius III died in 1555, and his successor, Pope Paul IV, really had no interest in continuing with the Council of Trent. In reality, he was a heavy-handed pope with an affinity for rigid orthodoxy and austerity. He enacted policies that would encourage more Jews to convert. He declared that all Catholic leaders had to treat Protestant leaders as heretics, and he exiled those who left their religious orders. He was quite unpopular with the people, and just before his death, the people began rioting in Rome. As part of that revolt, the people put a yellow hat on Pope Paul IV's statue that had just been erected. This was the same yellow hat that Pope Paul IV required Jews to wear in public. Then they held a mock trial of the statue, and after he was pronounced guilty, they decapitated the statue and threw the head into the Tiber River. Needless to say, Pope Paul IV was a very unpopular pope. On Christmas Day in 1559, the world got what probably felt like a great Christmas gift: a new pope, Pope Pius IV. And in February of 1562, after nearly a decade, the Council of Trent got restarted. Session 21, which occurred in July of 1562, focused on communion, addressing the question of whether it was sufficient to receive just the body or the most precious blood. The session concluded that while one should receive under both species, Christ was truly and fully present in either species. In other words, if you only receive the body, it's not like you're only getting half of Jesus. Session 22, which occurred in September of 1562, focused on the celebration of the sacrifice of the Mass. This appears to be in response to some Protestants declaring that the priesthood was unnecessary, more of an old covenant theology, and that the Mass was some sort of re-sacrificing of Jesus. This also set strict parameters around the liturgy of the Mass. If you recall from the last episode, Huldrych Zwingli had essentially revamped the entire liturgy of his Mass that he celebrated at his church. The 23rd session took place in July of 1563 and focused on holy orders, the purpose of ordaining priests, requirements of priests, age requirements, and so forth. Session 24, which occurred in November of 1563, reaffirmed the sacrament of matrimony, banning practices like marrying relatives, polygamy, civil marriages not performed by the parish priest, etc. Remember that the English Reformation began when King Henry VIII wanted an annulment from his wife Catherine of Aragon, and when Pope Clement VII wouldn't grant him one because his marriage was lawful, King Henry VIII started his own church, the Church of England, and declared himself the sovereign over the church. Furthermore, Protestants were leaving religious life, where they had taken vows of celibacy, and getting civilly married. Most notably, Martin Luther, who was an Augustinian priest, married a nun, Katharina von Bora. In December of 1563, the Council of Trent held its last and final session, Session 25. It reaffirmed its stance on purgatory. From the last episode, you may remember that Martin Luther called it into question most famously in the Leipzig debate in 1519. The session also reaffirmed its practices of using and venerating images, icons, statues, and relics. This goes all the way back to the Seventh Council, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which took aim at the heresy of iconoclasm. It was Huldrych Zwingli and his supporters that were tearing out all the sacred images of churches in this furious attempt to resurrect the heresy of iconoclasm. And it was that strand of Protestantism that led to even more radical offshoots like the Amish, which prohibit any kind of picture, including photographs and paintings of relatives. The Council of Trent concluded on December 4, 1563, and was ratified by Pope Pius IV on February 7, 1564, officially making the Council of Trent the Church's 19th Ecumenical Council. The Council of Trent marked the beginning of what is known as the Counter Reformation. As part of these efforts, in 1570, Pope Pius V launched a new Roman Missal that standardized the liturgy, emphasizing adoration and sacrifice. This is also known as the Tridentine Mass, or traditional Latin Mass, and would serve as the official liturgy of the Roman Rite for 400 years. The Counter-Reformation also saw the reform of corrupt practices like the selling of indulgences that was the impetus of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. There was a greater emphasis on seminary education to create better formed clergy, and the Counter Reformation saw a resurgence in missionary work. Pope Gregory XIII, who ruled from 1572 to 1585, was an early champion of the Counter Reformation. In 1575, he convened a year of jubilee, and thousands of pilgrims descended to Rome. He himself participated in elaborate processions and celebrated masses piously so as to be a visible example as a leader. This was in sharp contrast to previous leaders like Pope Alexander VI, aka the Borgia Pope. The Counter-Reformation continued until 1648 with the conclusion of the long and bloody 30 Years' War, which decimated Central Europe and resulted in the deaths of 4.5 to 8 million people. I want to end with this thought. As the Reformation surged in Europe and Catholics left the Catholic faith and bloody wars ensued, across the ocean, in what we call Mexico, a very different story was unfolding. The missionaries there were having a really hard time getting the Aztecs to convert to Catholic Christianity, and the Catholic missionaries often resorted to less than delicate tactics. All of that changed on a December day in 1531 when a peasant named Juan Diego encountered the Blessed Virgin Mary, who instructed him to build a shrine. When he asked for a sign, she caused non-native Castilian roses to grow on the top of Tepeyac Hill, in what is now in Mexico City. He picked them, folded them up in his tunic, and took them to the archbishop. And when he unfurled his tunic, a miraculous image appeared on his tilma, known as Our Lady of Guadalupe. The result of this miracle was mass conversions, daily baptisms by the thousands. The child-sacrificing pagan Aztec religion was instantaneously dismantled, not through war, not through aggressive conversion practices, but through a stunning miraculous image imprinted by the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the 16th century in Europe, millions left the Catholic Church and ripped out crucifixes and religious art. Meanwhile, in the Americas, millions were moved by the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe and became Catholic Christians. No one in history has pointed people to Jesus more than the Blessed Virgin Mary. And even though she is no longer here on earth, she continues to live out that mission. And perhaps that was the greatest act of the Counter-Reformation. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.